house that wasn't theirs. When Daniel and Emily moved into their new home, they believed it was the start of a brighter chapter. The small house sat at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by trees that whispered whenever the wind passed through. For them, it was an escape from the noise of the city, a place where they could begin fresh, away from debts, arguments, and the crushing weight of old memories. They'd painted the walls, set up their furniture, and told themselves the silence was proof that peace had finally arrived. But silence can lie. What they didn't know was that the house had once belonged to a man named Victor, a man who had lived inside those same walls for more than 20 years. He had lost the property after failing to pay off mounting debts. But Victor never believed the loss was his fault. In his mind, the system had been rigged, the banks had robbed him, and the new couple living in his home were nothing but strangers stealing what was rightfully his. For months he watched from the woods, memorizing their routines, learning the times when Daniel left for work and Emily remained alone. He wasn't interested in money. He wasn't even interested in their possessions. He wanted the house back, and he wanted them to feel the weight of his rage. The night he entered, the moon was hidden behind clouds. Emily was asleep on the couch when she heard the sound of a key twisting inside the back door. Confusion struck her before fear did. She thought it was Daniel returning early, but when she called his name, the only answer was the slow creak of the door closing. A man stepped inside, his face pale, his clothes ragged, his eyes burning with something far deeper than madness. Victor whispered that this was his home, his blood was in these walls, and that she and her husband were nothing but intruders. Emily tried to reason with him, her voice trembling, but Victor didn't come to listen. He came for revenge. He carried a rusted knife, one he claimed had belonged to his father, and he promised the house would remember the night it was taken from him. Emily backed away, her heart racing, every shadow in the room pressing down on her like it was a live dot. When Daniel returned, the house was locked from the inside. He forced his way in and found Victor standing over Emily, the knife glinting in the dim light. Daniel shouted, but Victor's rage turned wild, his words tumbling out in a storm of betrayal, injustice, and hatred for a world that had stripped him bare. He lunged, not at Daniel, but at Emily, screaming that she had to pay for living in his home. But power has a way of shifting when least expected. Emily, cornered and desperate, grabbed the nearest thing within her reach, a broken shard of glass from a picture frame that had fallen during the struggle. When Victor lunged again, she struck, the glass tearing across his throat in one sharp, trembling motion. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Victor collapsed, his blood seeping into the carpet he once called his own. Daniel held Emily, both shaking, realizing they had survived not because the walls protected them, but because Emily had turned fear into defiance. The house never felt the same after that night. Every room carried the memory of what had happened. Every creak in the floor sounded like a whisper from the man who believed it was still his. And though Victor was gone, Emily could never walk past the back door without feeling his eyes, watching, waiting, as if the home itself had absorbed his vengeance and was still deciding whether it truly belonged to them. The neighbor who wouldn't stop. Sarah had never known comfort. Life had given her 2 children and then stripped away everything else. Her husband had abandoned them years ago, leaving nothing behind but debt and broken promises. She worked double shifts at a diner, slept little, and kept food on the table by sheer willpower. Their home was small, barely standing, but it was all she could afford, and within those cracked walls, she told her children they were safe. But safety is fragile when cruelty grows just a few steps away. Her neighbor, Paul, lived 2 houses down. At first he seemed harmless, just another man who drank too much and muttered too loudly. But Paul had a cruel edge that sharpened every time Sarah refused his requests. He would ask for money, cigarettes, even rides into town, and when she said no, his smile would vanish, replaced with a glare that carried the promise of payback. Rumors said Paul had once been in prison, though no one knew exactly why. Sarah tried to ignore him, telling herself that men like him barked louder than they bit. But she was wrong. One night after another long shift, Sarah came home to find the house too quiet. Her children were asleep upstairs, but something felt wrong, like the air was too heavy, the silence too deep. She checked the locks twice before forcing herself to breathe. Hours later, just as the moon shifted across the window, she heard it the slow turn of the doorknob. At first, she thought she was imagining it, exhaustion tricking her senses. Then, the door opened and Paul stepped inside. He reeked of alcohol, his smile wide and crooked, his voice slurred but laced with menace. He told her she had been too proud for too long, that she thought she was better than him, and tonight he would remind her of her place. His words were knives cutting deep, each one sharpened by bitterness and years of failure. Sarah froze, fear screaming in her chest, but then her eyes flicked toward the staircase, where her children slept. They could not wake to see this. They could not be the victims of his rage. Paul moved closer, waving a pocket knife he had pulled from his jacket. He bragged that no one would hear her scream, that no one cared about a poor single mother struggling to survive. He thought his strength made him untouchable. But Sarah had lived years in silence, years of pain, years of being dismissed and overlooked. And pain, when carried too long, can turn into something stronger than fear. She whispered for her children not to come downstairs, then grabbed the only weapon within reach, a broken lamp lying near the couch. Paul laughed at the sight of it, mocking her, saying it was useless. But when he lunged forward, expecting her to crumble, she swung with every ounce of rage, exhaustion, and desperation she had buried inside. The lamp shattered against his head, and he stumbled back, dazed but not broken. He came again, angrier now, blood dripping down his temple, his knife raised high. Sarah did not back away. She struck again, harder, faster, her screams filling the room as years of injustice poured out in every blow dot. By the time the fight ended, Paul was lying on the floor, motionless, his knife slipping from his hand. The room was silent except for Sarah's trembling breath. She stood there, gripping the broken lamp, her hands shaking, her body bruised but unyielding. For the first time in years, she felt powerful, not because she had chosen violence, but because she had refused to be broken by it. When her children came downstairs, wide-eyed and frightened, Sarah knelt and held them close. She whispered that they were safe, but in her heart, she knew safety would never mean the same thing again. The house had seen her strength, and the night had witnessed her defiance. Paul had thought he was the predator, but the truth was far darker, sometimes survival. demands becoming something stronger than fear, something even cruelty cannot crush. The old man's last stand. Henry was 80 years old, a man the world had already written off as weak, fragile, and harmless. He lived alone in an aging farmhouse at the edge of town, the kind of place most people forgot was even there. But behind his silence was a story that many wished to erase. Years ago, Henry had testified against a powerful businessman who had built his empire by exploiting workers, cheating families, and ruining lives. Henry had spoken the truth in court, and that truth had destroyed the man's empire, sending him to prison where he died. Ever since, Henry lived in the shadow of enemies who despised him, waiting for the day their vengeance would find him. That day arrived one cold night, when the businessman's son came to settle the score. His name was Raymond, and he had inherited not just his father's anger, but his cruelty. He believed Henry had stolen everything from his family wealth, pride, and legacy. In his mind, justice would only be restored when the old man's blood stained the very floor he walked on. Raymond didn't come with the clumsy arrogance of a burglar. He came prepared, stalking Henry's routines, studying the creaks of the house, the lights he left on, and the times he slept. He waited until the town was deep in silence, then slipped through the farmhouse door with a crowbar in hand, convinced this would be easy. To him, Henry was just a frail relic, a man too weak to fight back. But Raymond underestimated the years Henry had lived with fear. Henry had known this night would come. Every sound of the wind against the windows reminded him of it. Every quiet hour of the night told him someone would return for revenge. He had prepared not with weapons of strength, but with patience and cunning. The farmhouse was no longer just a home. It was a trap. As Raymond crept down the hallway, the floor groaned louder than expected. He reached the bedroom door, ready to strike, but the room was empty. Instead, the light flickered on, and Henry's voice echoed from the shadows. Calm, steady, and chilling, he told Raymond he had been waiting. Raymond snarled, demanding he come out, but the old man's words carried something heavier than fierce certainty. One by one, doors slammed shut. Windows he thought were open were bolted from the outside. The farmhouse groaned and shifted like it was alive, every corner built into a maze Henry had designed over years of paranoia. Raymond realized too late that he was not the hunter, but the prey. When he finally saw Henry, the old man stood tall despite his frail frame, holding nothing but a lantern. His eyes burned with a quiet fire, the kind that comes not from rage but from surviving too much to surrender now. Henry spoke of the years he had carried the weight of truth, the nights he had waited for vengeance, and the justice he had delivered when no one else dared. Then he promised that the cycle would end tonight. Raymond lunged, screaming, swinging the crowbar with wild fury, but the house betrayed him again. The floor beneath his feet gave way, a trapdoor Henry had built into the cellar. Raymond fell, crashing into the darkness below, the crowbar clattering uselessly beside him. The old man locked the door above, sealing him inside. For hours, Raymond raged, shouting threats, pounding on the walls, demanding release. Henry sat silently in his chair, the lantern casting shadows across his weathered face. When dawn arrived, the farmhouse was still. Raymond's voice had gone hoarse, then silent. The only sound was the soft creak of Henry rising to his feet. He walked to the door, stared at the lock one last time, and whispered that justice had always been about more than courtrooms. Then he left the house, never looking back, because he knew the farmhouse itself had become the final judge, jury, and executioner. From that night forward, no one saw Henry again. Some said he moved away, others whispered he vanished into the woods. But the farmhouse remained, its windows staring like empty eyes, holding the memory of the night when an old man turned vengeance into a weapon sharper than any blade, proving that sometimes the weakest are the ones that darkness should fear the most.